This is your PowerPoint on the industrialization and urbanization for your PowerPoint quiz. The sources for industrialization. The United States had numerous areas of natural resources. For example, in California, Nevada, and Colorado, there was gold and silver. In Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, California, and Alaska, there was plenty of oil. And in Ohio, Colorado, and Wyoming, there was coal. These forms of energy formed the basis for the ability for an industrial revolution in the United States. But on top of that, there had been a number of new technologies that spurred on innovations that made it possible for this industrial revolution to take place. Just a few examples. Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts made factories much more possible to work much more quickly. Edison's use of electricity provided the light needed for working hours in the development of cities. And the DuPonts provided chemicals, dyes, and fertilizers that allowed for the lubrication of machinery that allowed for mass production. Henry Ford. Ford created an organizational innovation that allowed for technology to work so much more quickly. He had people who would specialize on one task on a conveyor belt. This allowed for the mass production of goods. And whenever you mass produce goods, this efficiency allows for the lowering of prices. Another man, Frederick Taylor, observed all this and created a belief in standardizing movements and time in order to create as efficient a workforce as possible. For example, Frederick Taylor noticed at one point in a factory that people were digging ditches on one side of the factory while the shovels were on the other side of the factory. Whenever somebody broke a shovel, they would walk all the way from one side of the factory to the other in order to get one. Like most people, when you have a chance to relax from work, people would take their time walking back and forth. This lost out on time for production, so he provided a very simple solution. Put the shovels next to the ditch. Now I know it sounds really simple, but the point of Frederick Taylor and what became known as Taylorism was the ability to make all these new types of rules and standardized movements to make sure that things would be far more efficient so that you could mass produce goods. The farming vision. The vision of all Federalists and Republicans, these were the major factions at the beginning of the country, had been to connect industry to farming resources. This could finally be done through the Transcontinental Railroad. The government issued grants to railroads to build these connections. The problem was that big farming businesses began to settle in the West. This created domestic and foreign competition. Small farmers now had to purchase everything from the farm to fertilizer seed and new machines like the McCormick Reaper. It became difficult for the small farmer to keep up because the large farming businesses could so much more easily mass produce. The big farming problem. Farmers had a contradiction that was different from industrialized capitalism. In industrialized capitalism, the point is to mass produce. And you can do this if you have enough machines and enough labor. You just keep producing goods and items. That allows you to mass produce and to lower prices. But farms are different. Farms face a number of problems or limitations. They have a limited land area. They have a limited production they can do on that land. And the land can only produce so much of a variety of goods. Because of this, farmers face overproduction. As the farmers produce, prices drop. Remember, farmers want people to be buying goods, so they need to keep prices coming down. But the problem, especially for small farmers, is that as prices come down, they start to spiral downwards. And now farmers cannot keep up with the costs that they have on the land. The Giants of Industry, Part 1. Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was an immigrant from Scotland who came to America penniless. In fact, he fits into the American story, the idea that you can come as an immigrant, start off at the bottom, and work up through the top. He did this by working in internships, where he learned how to invest through the stock market. He eventually saved up enough money to buy steel mills, and then he created a process called vertical integration, whereby he would buy all the industries that it took to make steel. This allowed him to undercut his competition, since he controlled the process to make steel, and therefore didn't have to pay other people to make this product. Giants of Industry, Part 2. John Rockefeller bought oil industries and created something called horizontal integration. He would pool money with some competitors in order to buy out other competitors. He also created trusts, whereby he would invest in smaller oil companies to eventually own them. He used a number of questionable tactics, though, as well, in order to control the market. For example, he used industrial spies, who would go out and discover the weaknesses of other companies. He also made rebates with railroad companies to control transportation. Here's how this would work. He would go out to a railroad company and he would promise them that they would get all of his business as long as they provided him a rebate or a discount. but there was one added thing on there. He also said that these railroad companies would not be allowed to do any transportation with any of his competitors. Now, you might wonder why railroad companies would care to take this deal. John Rockefeller had such a huge amount of the market that if they didn't take this deal, then they would lose out on transportation for one of the biggest sources of profit, and they knew that would undercut their business. But the minute they agreed to this deal, this undercut transportation for John Rockefeller's competitors, which means it narrowed the market. Giants of Industry Part 3. J.P. Morgan bought out the banks and believed that the credit system was the basis to all capitalist growth. At the time, he saw disorder in a banking system that lacked a central national bank, so he established what's called interlocking directorates. He would provide money to small failing banks. In return, he would have some of his directors sit on the boards of these directors of other banks and control their decision making. Eventually, he was in charge of all these major banks, and what this did was set rules that would favor his centralized bank. Even though it wasn't a national bank, J.P. Morgan was basically creating a monopolization of the private sector's banks. Conditions for the workers. Industrialization attracted what were called the new immigrants. These included people from Eastern and Southern Europe. The workers tended to work 70 hours per week. Men would receive $7 to $10 per that time of the week. Women received $1.50 per that week, and children received $1 for that week. There were no laws at the time to protect workers from poor working conditions, and this was because at the time the government operated under what was called laissez-faire. The idea of laissez-faire was for the government to keep its hands off of the economy. If the government stayed out of intervening in the economy, the idea was that natural competition in the economy would help for prices to remain low, wages to remain high because companies would want to attract good workers, and conditions supposedly would resolve themselves just because workers would be able to go from one company to the next. The labor union response. However, as we can imagine, these types of solutions did not really happen within the market at the time. So because of that, workers looked for other solutions. Now, in some countries, workers looked for radical solutions like socialism or anarchism or communism. But within America, even though there were some members who did this, it never really took off anywhere. The real idea that most people tended to have was a more moderate solution called labor unions. Labor unions were formed as a compromise between radical revolution and free market capitalism. The major unions at the time included the Knights of Labor, led by Terence Powderly, who wanted an 8-hour workday and end the child labor, minimum wage, and an integrated workforce. The AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, who only wanted to have skilled workers. They wanted to have bread and butter issues like minimum wage, protections at work, and an 8-hour workday. And then there was a radical union that attracted a smaller percentage of workers called the IWW, or the International Workers of the World. They were a radical union group that promoted socialism as the only real solution to the problems that workers faced. Ideological changes. Most people at this time period who supported capitalism supported something called social Darwinism. The idea had been adapted from Charles Darwin's theory on the descent of man, and it was promoted by people like Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, who argued the poor were poor due to inherited biological traits of evolution. On the opposite side was the social gospel, led by Protestant minister Walter Rauschenbusch and Jane Addams. They argued the poor were poor due to unequal social and economic conditions. They believed that the government was needed to protect basic workers' rights and equal pay. Jane Addams set up a group of houses called the Hull Houses, which took in immigrants and tried to teach them the skills that they needed so that they could enter into the labor force. But eventually, people like Rauschenbusch and Jane Addams argued there would have to be some kind of reform at the governmental level in order to solve these problems. Black Leaders, Part 1. Booker T. Washington, at the time period, spoke in Atlanta, Georgia, and called for the Atlanta Compromise. He told African Americans that they should stay in the South. He argued that blacks should learn basic technical skills, and he created the Tuskegee Institute. He argued that if black people did not participate in politics to solve their problems, but rather attempted to create strong families and use self-help, that eventually they would earn the respect of the white leaders of the country, and that would end racism in the United States. Black Leaders 2. As you can imagine, many other black leaders disagreed with Booker T. Washington. W.B. Du Bois, for example, was the first black African-American individual to graduate from Harvard. He argued that African Americans had to participate in politics in order to fight for their rights against white racism. He proposed training what he called the talented tenth, or the top 10% of the black population. that would lead them in this political fight, a political antagonism within the system, not a violent revolution, to change laws through the courts. He did this by creating the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He also argued something else that's become very popular today. It's known as the divided soul. This is very similar to our notion today of multiculturalism. And the idea is this: are black people American or are they African? W.E.B. Du Bois argued they are both. It is impossible, according to W.E.B. Du Bois, for a black person in America to simply return to Africa. If they were to go back to Africa, of course, they would be leaving their identity that had been formed here by their ancestors in America. Yet at the same time period, African Americans did not come here freely. They came here as slaves, which means that they were transported along with their culture from Africa. And it's not as if this just vanished. So from here on out, black people in America had what he called a divided soul. On the one hand, they were American. Their ancestors had lived here and helped to build the country. Yet a good part of their identity goes all the way back to Africa, in some ways being lost by slavery, but in many ways being transported as cultures merged.